Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm excited to be talking about the series Devil in Disguise, John Wayne Gacy, with creator, showrunner, and also director of episode 8, Patrick Macmanus. And in starting off and talking about the way that you've told this story, it's a very different lens into the true crime genre in the fact that you thought very specifically about wanting to tell it from the lens more so of the victims. And we have multiple episodes where we have flashbacks and we really see a lot of their lives not even connected to when things happen to them with their interactions with him. And I was interested in just the journey to really understanding that that was the perspective that felt really important in telling this particular story.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been with Universal content and by conjunction with Peacock for a really long time, for almost a decade. And I say that because we know each other very, very well. And we don't really hide things from each other. So which is an amazing gift, honestly, at working in this industry. And so they came and they asked me to do it, and I said no. And they came and they asked me to do it, and I said no. And on the third time, I said I'll watch the documentary. Let me see. And at that time, we were filming Dr. Death season 2 in New York. I was living in Paris. Ashley Michael Hoban, who was a writer, producer, and director on Devil in Disguise, that was her show. So I flew to New York to take her out to dinner to thank her for letting me live in Paris while she did all the work. And I had 8 hours in my hotel room in New York, and so I just watched the documentary. The documentary is amazing. Absolutely one of the most phenomenal documentaries on serial killers I've ever seen. But it didn't change my mind. In fact, it reinforced in me the fact that I didn't want to do a serial killer story. And so I called up my partners, my collaborators at Universal and Peacock. And I just said, look, I just don't see it. I was like, but I have an idea, and if you let me do it, I'll agree to do it. And so that was the idea of trying to focus the story on the police and the prosecution, defense, and the families. And I said, and I want to focus on the victims, but I didn't know what that meant. But they said, okay. And I keep telling the story where I thought that they were lying to me just to get me to do it, and that they were eventually going to turn the screws on me, and I'd already been ensnared, and so I was going to have to do their bidding. But the truth of the matter is that from that moment that they said yes on, they have to this second today, they have been nothing but supportive of this idea. But it was an evolution because, as I said, I didn't know that that I was going to do these victim stories. We called them short stories until much later in the process, in the development process. And when we came on that idea, like when we figured that idea out, it all just sort of fell into place. And what they were supportive of, and is a bit of a gamble. I mean, I keep talking about this too, that it's a bit of a gamble, this series, because we very purposely don't show any murders. We don't show any of the typical violence that you would see in true crime. And we take our foot off the accelerator quite a bit in order to explore these young boys and men's lives that, as you said, had nothing to do with John Wayne Gacy or their abduction or their assaults or their murders or their burials. And that is, you know, a roll of the dice. I mean, we know the other works, right? We know the other version of doing these stories works very, very well, and I make no judgment about it. I am curious if this will work because I think it's important. I think it's special. I think that it's something that I will attempt to try to emulate as I go forward doing more true crime. And I think that it might change the direction of some of true crime in going in the future. And that wasn't the reason to do it. It's just something that is aspirational at this point.
I mean, I really felt in watching it that from telling it more so from the victims' perspectives, that it added a lot more layers of connection to the story and to the characters and to their voices, and was really interested in how that impacted the way that you researched this project in a very different way. And I know that you work with Patrick Murphy, who's a researcher on many, many projects of yours. And how was that a completely different scope of research in terms of really looking into their families, because that's less publicly available information than the information on John Wayne Gacy.
By the way, good for you. I appreciate that. Patrick is he's one of the greatest things that has ever happened to me, and I include my wife and kids in that category too. He is a genius at what he does. He is the most amazing researcher I have ever met. Um, and so quite a bit of it was I just know Patrick. Like I basically go. and he ran off and did his thing. It didn't change. I will just to answer your question bluntly. It didn't change how we approached it. It most certainly changed the experience in the writers' room. It most certainly changed the experience on set. But as it related to the research, it became another avenue of us of storytelling, right? Because we were as intimately involved in figuring out what went on with Amarante and Kunkel and the victims' families and finding out their backstories, um, as we were with whatever we did with Gacy. That was another full avenue of investigation that we went into, and then we just had to try to figure out how we were going to unpack it and weave it all together. But I will say that how it changed in the writers' room in particular. These writers I've worked with, one of them for almost 14 years, another one for a decade. The others for some semblance of either never, our staff writer, to 6 to 7 years with the others. By sort of happenstance, the room is predominantly queer, and these are just people I've worked with for a million years. And the experience of 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 us researching and unpacking and writing about these very real people, but watching it be filtered through the lens of our writers' present day experience or experiences from 5 years ago or 10 years ago, as they struggled with their identity, as they struggled with the way that the world viewed them, or their families viewed them, or their cultures viewed them, or their religions viewed them, right, was an extraordinarily powerful moment. The whole experience. I mean, I have chills talking about it right now because I just sat back and listened and just and you can feel it on the page and you can feel it in on the screen that while these are other people that we're writing about and that we're exploring, it's the writer's experiences. And that's a both it's both something that I'm extraordinarily grateful for and and deeply saddened by, you know. So it brought a lot to the experience that I could never repay them for, ever sharing what they shared.
Yeah, no, it's really remarkable. And, I think the other thing from that comes through from the writing and the way that this story is told is looking at the impact of law enforcement and, even Gacy's lawyer and seeing the emotional impact that this is a case unlike anything any of them had ever worked on or had to experience as people who see a lot of the worst of humanity in the day-to-day of their jobs already. And so, how did you want that to be a constant thread and really just revisiting over the course of several years how it lingers with all of them in very different ways, but all with a lot of depth?
Yeah, I mean, look, talking about research, one of the early things that we stumbled on in it over and over and over again was the effect that being in Gacy's house, excavating his crawl space, had on these men. It was almost entirely men. The effect that it had on them as individuals, the effect that it had on them as a team, the effects that it had on their home lives, the effects that it had on their abuse of alcohol, some into drugs, that this was unlike anything that any of them had ever seen before. And I mean, I'm positive that you would use the term PTSD for all of them. They definitely would not have known that term or used that term back then. But and it was important for us to balance that with the systemic failure of the police over the course of Gacy's reign, because those two sides of the coin were equally important to tell. And I'm appreciative that you brought that up because it is so easy for us to just focus on the demonization of the police. And to be frank, that systemic failure is a driving reason why we told that story. It's a driving reason why, our production company told Girl from Plainville, which was ultimately about various failures in the mental health, Dr. Death, which was absolutely systemic failure in the world of medicine. And so us telling that story is the reason that we're telling this entire story, which is the fact that what makes this a relevant story has nothing to do with John Wayne Gacy, has nothing to do with murder or serial killers or true crime. It has to do with the fact that all of the various isms in the world allowed him to get away with it. And as we all know, as people who read and watch and look at the world around us, all of those isms are as strong now, if not stronger, than they have ever been before. And so it's important to us, all of us as storytellers, the writers, the actors, the directors, that the point be made that as much as the police were trying their best to do the right thing on this side, it was because of all of these prejudices that Gacy got away with what he got away with for as long as he did.
And part of how he got away with everything for so long as well is because, very different to a lot of true crime and stories that we hear about serial killers, he was so affable. And I've heard that you kind of went through a bit of a journey with feeling like it almost didn't feel true how affable he was to people and how generous he was in certain situations. He'll help you fix your car tire if you need it. He's always the guy that's there to help you out. And I know that that's something that Michael Chernus kind of also went through the discovery of like, no, actually, it is really true. And so, how did you strike that balance of making sure that you captured that in a really realistic way, but kind of never used it as like, oh, but also he was a good guy at the same time as doing all these terrible things because that could have lent into that territory?
Yeah, I mean, it was a struggle for everyone. And me first and foremost, like, because again, I started all alone, all by myself in a dark room trying to figure this story out. And as I started to put pen to paper, I wish it was pen to paper. As I started to type on my MacBook Air, you know, I had to get myself to this place where I allowed him to say the things that he said because it is so much easier, and I don't, that's sort of dismissive of other pieces of this in the serial killer genre, but it's super easy to be disturbing and dark and like, right? But the entire point of the show, and I think Chernus says it often, and he says it so much better than I could ever say it, is that it would be a disservice to the victims and to everyone around him if he wasn't that way, because you have to explain why they got into the car, why they took the job, why they had the drink, right? And if you feel this is a serial killer coming at you all the time, well then it's a little bit on you. But Gacy was, he was a Democratic precinct captain. He was like part of, like, he was like the lighting, on the lighting, head of the lighting commission, right? In his town. He was the clown, right? All of these things that you would never expect. Even the fact that his home was like 10 minutes from the airport. He was literally in the middle of suburbia.
Yeah.
Says everything about who this man really was and how he got away with it as well. But it's
That
tough.
it really is such a fine line to balance. And there's this other aspect that we see with him throughout, which is there's the version of reality which you're seeing on screen, and then there's a completely different version of events that he's constantly telling everybody around him. Oh, as soon as I get out of here soon, then I'll be back home and I can explain everything away to everyone and everything's going to be fine and back to normal. And he kind of feels that throughout. And there's even a moment where he's saying that he was helping someone out. He invents this other fictitious character, a guy named Jack, as a way of explaining it. And so how did you kind of come up with the idea where anytime he's telling a different version of events, you then want to show us something of the reality to make sure that it never feels believable?
I mean, so much of that, it's a really, really good question. So much of that is just rooted in reality. I mean, like, look, I'll say this. To this day, now 3 years into this in some way, um, I still am not, I still don't know if he was acting insane, like on purpose to try to give himself an alibi to get out of, right? Or if he genuinely believed what he believed. Like most of me believes that he was putting on an act. And simply because of what they found in his attic, which was all of the, a bunch of books that had to do with the, insanity defense, and he had highlighted it and dog-eared it and all this stuff. So we sort of leaned in the direction that that is what he was doing, which then absolutely made it incumbent on us to figure out a way to ensure that the audience saw what the historical record says about these things. But to be fair, and this is a very dangerous sentence to say, to be fair to Gacy, he was also, he learned this, right? Like the fact that he only went to jail for 18 months out of a 10-year sentence because he was the head cook, because he was like the head of the JCs in prison, because he befriended guards and the head of the prison, and everyone just figured this was a fluke. Let's let him out. he learned that his affability allowed him to get away with it, right? And so some of it, I think, is just learned behavior, where he's like, "Oh, if I'm just helpful, and if I'm just like chummy and nice, sure, I'll go away for a little bit, but I'm not going to go away forever." And I do think that all of it was highly calculated because of some learned behavior on his part.
And going back to a point that you were making right at the beginning about the fact that we don't see any of the murders committed on screen, we see kind of almost right up until that moment several times, and then you cut away, and there's something really powerful about what imagination can create, because you have a sense of what that scene that would have followed is, regardless of whether you see it or not. How did you come up with the way to kind of like lead into those moments and find where do we want to step back and actually go into a separate scene and allow the audience to create this moment for themselves?
So that was genuinely the only. I had a lot of sub rules of the road, but the only true rule of the road was that we would never show any of the murders. And I will say that I some of it was experience. I'll get into that in a second. Some of it was inspired by. So on the experience side of it, I had done Doctor Death, and early on in Doctor Death, before we got going, I had made the decision that we weren't going to show this. We were never going to be inside of the surgeries until the very last episode, the trial episode, and I found it fascinating to hear about, to read about people who thought we had shown all of the surgeries, that they had seen it all, and that it was so grotesque and it was so overwhelming, when in reality it was just sound design, and that we never put a camera on it until the end. And so some of it was just experience. It was like, oh, I know that if we do this thing, people will have this visceral experience without seeing it. They will fill in the blanks. But the other part was inspired by Zone of Interest. I thought it was a brilliant film, and it was very similarly, it gave a similar feeling, where you heard things or you saw distant things, right? And yet your brain filled in everything that was happening, even though you never saw it. And so that became a little bit of a touchstone for us in the writers' room, where I was like, can we accomplish something similar, which is that you just cut to something innocuous and you know what's happening. And in particular, it was written by Ashley Michael Hoban. It was directed by Larissa Kondraki, episode 6. That his first murder, the one of Tim McCoy, we're in the kitchen with sizzling bacon and smoke and water running when all of that is happening, and then Gacy comes running in, and so you are filling in those blanks automatically on your own. But it was mostly, again, we've seen enough violence in these things. I wanted to just try something different.
And there's a constant through line story wise with Robert Peast, who was the last known victim of him. And, it was very much him going missing that finally was the case that the police were taking seriously, because of his family really pushing for it so heavily. And how did that really give you a lot of the structure of the entire season of, we can kind of go through and move backwards and forwards in time with these different stories, but that's really the through line of the present, is following that case over the course of several years, right up until, and through the trial and beyond.
Yeah, so the only stories structurally that I knew where they were going to land when they landed when I started was Rob Peast at the top. I knew that Johnny Sick was going to be number two, simply because of the discovery of his high school graduation ring, and I knew that that was going to tie into that story. And then I knew that Jeffrey Rignall was going to be the final victim story. Those I knew from the jump. I thought that it was important to start with Robert Peast, because everything that we learned was that it was exactly what you said. Because he came from an upper middle class family, like a quote unquote good family, the police paid attention. But it was important that we saw that happen at the top, because, to be clear, other young men, young boys, families did go to the police, did try to do anything and everything to find their child, and no one paid attention to them, because of what their socioeconomic background was, because of what possible criminal history they may have had, obviously because of their sexuality, their identity was a driving reason why. And so I thought it was important to set the baseline of what the police did under the most ideal situation, to then see how things devolved when it was not someone that they really cared about. Um, Only to then end with Jeffrey Rignall, who was the only one who literally delivered him to the police, and the police did nothing. And I thought that that was important, that we saw. that we saw that as the as our last image of the show was somebody who was so dismissed from by the police because of his sexuality, even though he literally had an address and a license plate number, and they still wouldn't listen to him. And then Gacy went on to kill four more young men, including Rob Peast, after that.
I also wanted to talk about Michael Angarano's character, Sam, who becomes his defense lawyer, because he's very much at the precipice of his career. And so we see him weighing up the pros and cons of taking this case. And it'll get my name out there, it'll get me other jobs, it'll help me in setting up my own business. But then we see so much of the fallout that he experiences and the way it affects him and his family throughout the course of many years as well. And how did you want that story to be really be explored, and what felt important in looking at the dichotomy of the work that he's doing and kind of a rising career, but also the price that he ultimately is also paying for that at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's this is inspired by, right? This is not a documentary, and so what we knew in our research was that Sam did struggle with whether or not to take this case. And he struggled, everything you saw on screen, he struggled because he A knew that this guy was guilty because he had confessed to everything. Um, and then two things sort of kicked in. Number one was genuinely, I think he genuinely has a belief in the system of law, right? And the idea that everyone deserves a defense. That is something that is absolutely true. But I also think that there is a very human reaction, which is like I'm aspiring to something more. And so I led with saying this is inspired by because I will never be able to get into Mr. Amarante's head or heart. But if you weigh those two pieces of the things that we do know, right, and then you do find out that he became a very young judge shortly after the Gacy case, and we also know that he became something of a pariah as well. Like people did judge him. Well, then the story that we began to sort of spin out was one of the devil tempting Jesus on the Mount, right, where he stepped into the darkness of this abyss. He did everything he could do in order to save his client's life. He was rewarded with a judgeship. I'm sure it's not just because of it, but it probably had something to do with it. And how how do you feel about that in the end? Like, do you feel like it was all worth it? And we never answer that question. We never fully explore that question, but we leave it there for audience interpretation, which is, what do you think he thinks at the end of days? Does it was it worth it? And the answer very well may be yes, because not just because he got something out of it in terms of a judgeship, but more importantly, because he held to his belief system as somebody who was a defender of the Constitution and the defender of the right to every person to have a vigorous defense.
Yeah, it's so interesting, just like the dialogues and the conversations and the questions that come up from that. And also in talking about the way that you've ended every single episode, where there's archival materials, footage. Sometimes it's the drawing that he literally drew of, this is where you're going to find the bodies in my home, or, the pictures of the victims whose stories you're telling on screen throughout that episode, so that we get to see who the real person was for a moment. What was the process of kind of going through all the archive material as you were doing all the research and finding which pieces felt like they would bookend each of the episodes in that way?
Yeah, I mean that's something that I once again turn to my extraordinary experience in this writer's room. We were I mean, look, we you talk about a million things in a writer's room, not the least of which is lunch orders and what you did last night. But one of the things that we were trying to figure out was how do we really land that this is a show that is about the victims and beyond just the short stories. And that is something that one of our brilliant writers came up with, and it did become a process. It's so easy to pitch and be like, yeah, we're going to do these pictures, but then you have to find them, you have to get approvals for them. Most of them were out of the public record, but that went to Patrick. Patrick Murphy was a big driver of that, as was our writer's assistant Amber Robinson, who comes from the news world, and and the research section of the news world as well. So Patrick and Amber sort of got together, and they started pulling pictures, and they worked with our with NBC Universal to figure out what we could use. The one photo that we knew that we needed was the photo of Johnny Sick in his prom tuxedo, because it just so matched up with the story. And that one was actually a bit of the process. Everything else sort of fell into place really quickly, but it really is, once again, foundationally, an example of what we're trying to do, which is that this is not fiction. That this is It's so easy for you to fall into this thing as being a piece of fiction, and once you see the reality, up to and including that the map, which is a huge one, um, it does it does sort of cut your legs out from under you at the end of every episode. And I mean that in a good way. Like, you're like, oh, that was a really entertaining thing that I just watched. I hope, only to then see the reality. And I think it like lets the air out in a very effective way. And it did for me. I mean, I've watched this show 100 and I think I've watched like 117 hours of this show, because throughout the editorial process, and every time that I get to the end and those photos, it gets me every single time. And that's impressive, because you sort of go blank after a while watching all of the episodes, but those photos get me every time.
And also to your point, because it's not fiction as well, it's not something where there's a resolution to the end of the story. In the credits at the end of the last episode, we see details of, how the mismanagement of this case led to improvements, but it was never there for these victims and for their families, and even down to the scenes with the families at the execution, and seeing that they had the expectation of being in the room and felt like that would bring them some semblance of closure, and they didn't even get that. And so how did you land upon the emotion and kind of where you wanted to leave the audience in that way, with both the stories of the families and then also what you express in the credits?
So regarding the families, there is conflicting research on this. There are some families who seemed to know that they were just being led to this room. They were going to be in the vicinity of Hi, who's that?
Just my
Who's
cat.
that?
That's my
I'm
cat.
like, oh my God, what's the cat's name?
Casper. He was my pandemic foster fail.
I like them. Is always a bow tie on,
Always.
or
He's a
always
gentleman.
above? Fair enough. Good. He's raised ready for the night. Um, so cute. Um, I The conflicting evidence. Yeah, there were some families that seemed to know that they were just going to be in the vicinity of it, and there's evidence, or there's some research that supports that there were families that had no idea. They really did think that they were being brought into the room. And so, look, we. I think that it would be. How do I put this? I think that it would be unfair and unrealistic to end with some semblance of closure, right? That there was no world in which these families were ever going to have closure for what happened to them. And so the idea of them being denied, whether they knew, by the way, that they were not going to be in there, or whether they didn't know that they were not going to be in the room, either way, that is lacking one step closer to some semblance of justice, right? The idea that a bunch of, for lack of a more reductive term, dignitaries got to be in the room and they didn't, is a disservice to the families. And so we knew that we wanted to end the show leaving the audience with the idea that both the families never really saw justice in any true sense of the word, and by denying the audience the opportunity to sort of see it as well, we were denying them closure. And so we're definitely making multiple statements within the body of the end of that episode, as it relates to whether or not people really did feel as if justice was served. Again, I personally feel, this is just my personal feeling, that it was the last indignity for the families. And so I didn't want it to end. And the idea that there's still six victims that are unnamed, there's no closure there as well. I didn't want audiences to leave our show satisfied, because there was no reason to be satisfied.
Yeah, it's so interesting just to hear all of the different thought that went into everything because you can tell that, you know, this was a really in-depth process in thinking about how to tell this story. So it's been really, really fascinating. Thank you so much, Patrick. Really appreciate you talking about all of this.
Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate you taking it. And I got to at least meet Casper there at the end, so that's good too. So thank you.